Hello and welcome to day 2 of our WEO week of webinars on the new World Energy Outlook 2021, which we released last week. My name is Tim Gould. I'm the Chief Energy Economist at the IEA, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Theme for our discussion today is very topical, given what's happening in gas, coal, electricity markets. It's about the possibility of disorderly transition. So the theme is energy security, and that's obviously a theme that's very close to the heart of the IEA. The scenarios that you'll find in the World Energy Outlook, they describe smooth processes of change. Markets are always in equilibrium. Investments are calibrated to meet future demand, but we're acutely aware that that's not the way the world works in practice. There's always the possibility that supply and demand are out of whack. You have boom and bust cycles for investment. And of course, new risks to energy security can arise, particularly as you move through the transformation of the energy system towards a net zero world. So we cannot afford to ignore energy security issues because, as has been said often, if energy security, if energy transitions are not secure, if they're not perceived as being unreliable, then they won't be fast, and we need them to be fast. So we have a wonderful lineup today to discuss these issues. In a second, we'll hear from my IEA colleague, Tae-Yoon Kim, who'll introduce some thoughts on these issues that we've outlined from the new World Energy Outlook. And then we'll turn to reactions and comment from a very distinguished panel. And I'd like to introduce the members of the panel to you now. We have Jason Bordoff, who's a co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School and the founding director of the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Previously, he was a senior director for energy and climate change at the US National Security Council under President Obama. Nikos Tsafos is a chair for energy and geopolitics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, another world-renowned international think tank. And he's a leading commentator on the geopolitics of energy and climate. Sarah Hastings-Simon is an assistant professor and director of the Sustainable Energy Development Program at the University of Calgary. And we're also joined by Yoshi Kobayashi, who's a senior economist at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan, another world-leading think tank on energy and environmental issues. And he is a lead author of the IEJ's Energy Outlook, which was also released very recently. Thank you very much to this panel, this very distinguished panel, for being with us today. And thanks very much to also to all of you who are joining us online. We're going to proceed now with the introductory presentation from my colleague Tae-Yoon Kim, and then I look forward very much to hearing from our panel. So Tae-Yoon, across to you.
Thank you, Tim. It's a great pleasure to be here to discuss security issues in energy transition with a great panelist. As Tim mentioned, by design, the scenarios in the World Energy Outlook describe smooth and orderly processes of change. But in practice, however, the energy transition can be volatile and disjointed affairs characterized by competing interests and stop-go policies. Many the new challenges could arise in the process of energy transitions. I will touch upon some of these elements in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Energy transitions brings about major change in the energy mix, away from carbon-intensive fuels toward low-carbon energy sources. But there's a question mark over how far and how fast the change could happen. If there's no additional changes from today's policy settings, as in the stated policy scenario steps, oil demand remains well above 100 million barrels per day in 2050. And in announced pledges scenario, which we assume that all the net zero pledges are achieved in full and on time, the oil demand peaks in the 2020s and then declines to around 75 million barrels per day by 2050. In the net zero emission scenario by 2050, and oil demand falls further to 24 million barrels per day by 2050. And the comparable ranges for natural gas demand is also very huge. And these variations comes with some dramatically different implications for investment. In the net zero scenario, the investment in new field development is not required, although investment in existing oil field and existing assets and investment in reducing emission intensity are still required. On the other hand, in the stated policy scenario, the average investment requirement is well above today's levels. And this wide range poses some risks about either the market tightening or overinvestment, stranded asset, depending on how companies and investors read the policies and market signals. So a strong policy push to reduce demand is key to narrowing the range, this range, and also the minimizing the risk of market tightening. For many years, the world energy outlook has warned of a potential mismatch between investment in oil and gas and investment in clean energy technologies. In the case of oil and gas, the amount of spending on upstream today is around half of what it was in 2014. This was mainly driven by two price collapses in 2015 and in 2020. And actually, the oil and gas spending today is one of the very few areas that it is well aligned with the requirement in the net zero pathway. But as we all know, on the demand side, things haven't changed by as much, like anything like that. And on the right side, the investment in clean energy technologies remained relatively resilient in 2020, and we expect some slight uptick in 2021. But still, we are well out of line with what would be required in the net zero pathway, where investment need to more than triple over the next several decades. And the bottom line is when you don't have a right boost on the right-hand side figure, and you can have the left-hand side, the oil and gas figures, while maintaining reliable energy supplies. So the bans on the use of gas boilers or gasoline cars can only work when there are some low carbon options that can provide the energy services. So way forward is clear, a major boost in clean energy spending across all technologies and all markets. Otherwise, we may see more price upswings or the increased volatility in the future. So this year, we looked at some implications of price volatility for consumers in different scenarios. Today, the composition of household energy bills is around half for oil product and 1/3 for electricity and some natural gas. In the stated policy scenario, the average household energy bills rise by 15%. And there are some slight structural changes to the composition of household energy bills, but they are not that huge. In the net zero scenario, the bills falls by around nearly 10%. Why is this the case? Because buildings, appliances become more energy efficient, and heating, mobility become more electrified, and the average prices for oil and gas remain lower because of lower demand. Then what happens then if there's some spike in oil and gas prices? In our analysis, the impact in a case of rapid energy transitions are some 30% lower than those in a more gradual approaches. In other words, clean energy transition can cushion consumers from the stress of price spike for oil and gas, although some consumers, some households, some require some support from government to manage the upfront cost. In energy transitions, many new security challenges could emerge as our energy system become more electrified, much more interconnected, and rely much on variable renewables. For example, the share of variable renewables in power generation grow from just under 10% today to some 40% and 70% by 2050. And our energy system become much more complex. Today, the energy flows are relatively independent and simple. You extract natural gas from underground and use it in industry or buildings. But in the future, it becomes much more complex with multiple conversion steps involved. You use wind to produce hydrogen and store it, and then convert it back to synthetic fuels, and then use it in aviation. And these new characteristics of a new energy economy raise some important questions about market design. So how we set the electricity pricing when the share of variable renewables is very high, or how we properly recognize the system value of energy infrastructure that provide flexibility services. Another way to look at the changes in our energy system is to consider implications for trade in energy-related commodities. Today, the picture is very much dominated by oil, but energy transition brings some new characters onto the stage. Those are critical minerals such as lithium, copper, cobalt, and hydrogen. The combined share of critical minerals and hydrogen doubles in our announced pledge scenario to almost 25% by 2050. And in our net zero scenario, their share rises further to over 80% by 2050, completely overturning the current dynamics around international energy trade. And unlike many perceptions, these new elements are not immune from various security risks. The critical minerals are case in point. Over the past decade, we have seen some rapid reduction in the cost of clean energy technologies due to economies of scale or technology learnings. But the outcome of that is now the raw materials, including minerals and metals, account for a larger portion of total cost of clean energy technologies. That means any price spike in minerals and metals can have a major impact on the cost of clean energy technologies, which could make the transition effort either slower or more expensive. The recent price rallies in 2021 illustrate this point. All others being equal, they will increase the cost of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and power lines by some 5 to 15%. And the challenges are compounded by the lack of diversity in extraction and processing operations. So trade patterns and the producer economy policies and geopolitical considerations remain crucial, even as the world shifts toward more electrified and the renewable-rich energy system. Finally, there are some the new areas where the energy sector is likely to feel more greater impact going forward. They are growing frequency and intensity of extreme weather event. Already today, a large part of today's energy system is facing some increasing physical risks from a changing climate. In our analysis, around 1/4 of global transmission and distribution lines are face some high risk from disruptive cyclone wind. And over 10% of coastal refineries and thermal power plants are prone to severe coastal flooding. And half of the operating copper mines and some 1/3 of thermal power plants are located in high water stress areas. And the issue is that there are some other dimensions like extreme heat wave and also drought and wildfires. And also the issue is that these risks are set to increase over time with climate change. And this highlights some urgent need for policy actions to enhance the resilience of the energy system to climate change. So with that, I will hand over back to Tim and look forward to this discussion today. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tae-Yoon. I think that set us up very nicely. There's a lot there to unpick, and I'd like to return now to our panel to help us through some of that. There's obviously some debate, and I'd like to turn first to Jason Bordoff, please. There's some debate about the extent to which today's market imbalances can be linked to climate policies or clean energy transitions. In our view, there are a number of factors that have led to today's price spikes. There's been a strong demand recovery after the pandemic. You've had some planned and unplanned outages on the supply side, more than you would expect in a normal year. And then some of these weather-related factors that Tae-Yoon was just referring to, drought in Brazil, a long winter in Europe, heat waves in different parts of the world, all of which have put additional stresses on the system. So the IEA has said that, in our view, it's misleading to lay the responsibility for today's market developments on climate policies or energy transitions. Now, Jason, I know you've written and commented extensively on this over the past few weeks, so I'd like to ask your view on what's really behind what we're seeing today, and to what extent can you link it then to the processes underway in the energy sector?
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to the IEA for your great work on net zero and on the WEO, and for inviting me to participate in this really important session. I think this is one of the most important conversations we need to have about the risks and disruptive and messy pathway to net zero and how to smooth it. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I think on your question, this is sort of a confluence of a huge number of worst case scenarios in some ways. And the biggest factor is coming out of a historic pandemic. So you shut down the global economy and then you restart it and you juice it with a lot of stimulus. And it takes time for investment and supply chains to come back. And that's affecting lots of parts of the economy, like computer chips that are needed to make cars. And it's also affecting energy. So that I think is a primary factor, combined with an unusually cold winter, an unusually hot summer, low hydropower that boosted LNG demand around the world, questions about whether Russia is unable or unwilling to send more gas on a spot basis into Europe. And by the way, several of those factors I just talked about are not disconnected from the impacts of climate change: extreme temperatures, lower hydropower, all the rest. There are some factors that may have contributed or exacerbated, including climate policy, like the carbon pricing regime in Europe, but I think those are not the primary factors here. What I've written about, and not just in response to this crisis, but just more broadly, are it's a reminder. It would be wrong to sort of be complacent and say, well, this is just an extraordinary set of circumstances, everything will go back to normal soon. It may tell us something about the kind of tools that we need to make sure we have to buffer unexpected volatility, and the extent to which those tools may need to be enhanced or may be more difficult to use if you're shutting down baseload nuclear and you're ramping up renewables, or there's no reason to think you could take this share of the global economy, the lifeblood of the global economy, which is the energy system, completely turn it on its head really, really fast. But by fast, I mean 3 decades, relative to what Vaclav Smil tells us it normally takes for energy transitions to happen. And have that be smooth and predictable and linear. We're going to have fits and starts in policy ambition, and few countries better example of that than my own, going from Obama to Trump back to Biden. We're going to have unexpected and uncertain outlooks for innovation timescales, for the durability of political commitments, for geopolitical implications of this. And so we're going to have more, not less, volatility ahead if we get on track, which we are not anywhere close today with where we need to be, net zero 2050 and 1.5. And so I think the work you're doing here this morning and the work you did in the WEO to highlight those risks, some of them are economic and market-based. What if the investment, because of concerns about long-term durability of hydrocarbon demand, if that starts to wane, but it does so faster than actual demand is coming down and investments are going into renewables or other forms of clean energy, the level of investment you have told us we need, going from 2 to 5 trillion a year in the net zero scenario, that's a huge shift. Where's that money going to come from? $100 trillion roughly over the next 30 years. How much is public? How much is private? This is going to be really messy. And if we don't get it right, which there's almost no reason to think we should, so that economic volatility risks undermining public support for the transition. I think the same is true geopolitically. If you think about the fact that it was interesting to see the slide a moment ago looking at global trade and energy in 2050 in different scenarios. I'm sort of more interested in like 2030. So the process of transition. There's a conventional wisdom about the end state, post-fossil fuels. And as you know, that's not right for at least 2 reasons. I mean, one is net zero is not zero fossil fuels. The IEA net zero report tells us it's much less than today. But also we're nowhere close to being on track for that. And so the pathway in which we get there may not look exactly like the linear decline that the IEA has sort of modeled for us. And in those worlds, in the next decade or so, we may see the need for OPEC countries to balance volatility in markets more, not less. There may be more leverage before it declines. The same is maybe true for European dependence on the Russian gas markets. In the early days of a nascent hydrogen market or green ammonia market, where you're sending a few producers and a few buyers, will that kind of feel like the LNG market a few decades ago, where there's more, because you have less of a liquid market, more leverage that sellers have, and buyers are more vulnerable to disruptions in global supply. So, and of course, the critical minerals thing we talked about. So I just think there are a set of unexpected issues that we need to anticipate when we think about economic and geopolitical risks. And I think if affordability, reliability, security of supply, and national security come into conflict, real or perceived, with climate ambition, I worry climate ambition will wane in response. So we need to anticipate these risks, and then we need to build policy tools and market tools to de-risk the energy transition, in this process of getting to net zero, not just thinking about what the end state looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. That's extremely interesting. I mean, we've pointed out in some of our work that this sort of gap between rhetoric and reality when you're dealing with energy and climate. So a lot of the talk in the run up to Glasgow is around 1.5. I mean, the short-term trends in markets are obviously pointing in a different direction, as we point out in the WEO. The first response, in a sense, to that gap is, in a sense, we need to make reality a bit more like the rhetoric. But I mean, what you're saying seems to imply that there's also a problem with the rhetoric, in the sense that policymakers are not really preparing their public opinion for the possibility that these things will be tough, that these things will be potentially disjointed. Do you think that's fair?
I think we need to be a little more honest about how hard this is. And the numbers that you put out there in net zero 2050, and I won't repeat the sort of talking points that reporters and other stuff picked up. The largest solar park in the world today, building one of those every day for the next 30 years. I think you have 100 new nuclear plants in there by 2030. Obviously, we're nowhere close to on track for that. Huge improvements in energy efficiency, things that we need to do in the near term. So it's wonderful to see a growing share of 70-80% of global emissions now covered by commitments to get to net zero 2050. But there's a much smaller share of global emissions that are covered by binding policies to actually require us to get to net zero by 2050. And that is, we're struggling with that, obviously, in our own political context in the US today, and whether we can fully deliver climate policy that would be consistent with the US's own NDC by 2030. I hope we can. So I think at the same time, obviously, I should say the cost of inaction, the cost of not doing this, are much higher than the cost of doing it. That's important to note. And there are huge economic opportunities created by the transition itself. So we do need to close that ambition reality gap and help people understand what that pathway looks like.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jason. I'd like to turn now to Nikos and get into this process of change and the vulnerabilities that may emerge along the road. So I've seen you quoted in recent weeks saying that any big complex system can become more fragile when it's undergoing major change. And of course, energy system is par excellence a big and complex system. So what do you think are of some of the key fragilities that you think could become more visible as we move through this process? And do you think there are structural reasons that would lead us to expect more volatility as we go ahead?
Well, thank you, Tim. And first of all, let me also add my own congratulations to you and the team for this fantastic piece of work that the IA has put out. I want to make 3 points on this regard, because you're asking a very important question. The first one is, I think it's very important not to romanticize fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are secure because we have invested in them. We have built institutions, domestic and international, like the International Energy Agency, to manage their unreliability and their volatility. We have built resilience and redundancy over time. We have mandated that countries or companies have buffers and safety margins. And despite that work, which has taken decades, fossil fuels still fail us sometimes. So I think we have to really not cling to this idea that somehow we have an old system that is secure and that we are moving to a new system that is less secure. I don't think that's fair. We get however much energy security out of the system as the work that we put into the system. That's point number one. Point number two is we know from history that energy security is a reactive sport. We have a crisis, we see a vulnerability in a new way, and then we built up an institution to deal with that crisis. And so right now we have the system changing in a lot of ways that we're not quite sure what they mean for energy security and how to protect ourselves. We have carbon prices in Europe at unprecedented levels. We have no idea how energy markets are really going to react when carbon prices are at 60 euros a ton. We have interconnectivity between European and Asian gas markets that we've never had before, and we're not quite sure exactly what that interaction looks like. We have, of course, extreme weather, and we talked about that already. We have a far more electrified and also decentralized electricity system. I mean, you're seeing this in Europe a lot, where you have, private electricity suppliers coming under strain from the system. So it's hard to deal with one or two challenges in normal times. It becomes just that much harder when you have 4, 5, 6 changes happening all at the same time, and you're trying to secure a system that is very unfamiliar to policymakers. That's point number two. And the last point I think is important to make is that, as I see it, energy security is a journey. It's not a destination, right? I think there's this fantasy that volatility and ups and downs are the product of the hydrocarbon era. And once we get out of the hydrocarbon era, which, as Jason pointed out, we're not really going to get fully out of the hydrocarbon era, but once we transition to a low carbon energy system, we're going to get rid of this volatility. I think there's that view out there, and you hear a lot of policymakers talk about that. And I don't think that there's any way that this is going to be true. We, first of all, will need volatility because we're counting on a lot of storage in this world, whether it's going to be batteries or hydrogen or some other form of storage. Well, you only build storage if the prices today and tomorrow are going to be different. We're going to have to maybe not worry as much about oil and gas supply, but as you just showed, we're going to have to worry about the hydrogen supply. And if you think gas is hard, let's try to figure out how we're going to make hydrogen secure over the next 3 or 4 decades. We're going to go to a world, as you showed, that is far more electrified. Well, the electrified system has far fewer buffers, and it's a lot more susceptible to disruption because you really need that real-time supply and demand to match. We'll have, of course, extreme weather, we'll have carbon prices, and we can, of course, also mistime the transition where we're not investing enough in the system. So I think there's really no reason to expect that either the journey or the end point are going to be any less volatile than in the past. It's just going to look different. We're going to think about things in a different way. But I think we should really let go of this notion that either the old world was really secure, because it wasn't, and we worked very hard to make it as secure as we can. That's an important point. But we also should let go of this idea that somehow we're going to this wonderful destination where everything is going to be fantastic and safe and not volatile, because I don't think that's true either.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nikos. That's a fascinating set of observations. And I like the idea that this is a sort of reactive sport where you need to be constantly having these sort of feedbacks from the energy world back into the policy world. And do you think that we have the tools that we need? Do you think that we have the institutions that we need to sort of facilitate that kind of learning by doing? Are we ready for that kind of sport?
I don't think we are. And one of the things that really worries me, and you're seeing that in the US as well, is, as we've developed more liberalized and complex energy systems, the question of who's really in charge, who's meant to maintain energy security, who ultimately has responsibility for the system becomes a lot murkier. When you have a lot of regulators, you have, for example, in Texas, different regulators for the gas system or the power system. You have in Europe, different country level regulators, decentralized systems where no one is actually in charge or responsible for supplying the country with gas. Importers can bring as much gas as they want. So we have a real gap in the ability to sort of have that overarching view of how these systems are connected. We sort of regulate things individually, but we don't regulate them for the interconnectedness and the interactions that may arise in a very complex system. And that's the thing that worries me the most, is that we just don't have that overarching view to put the pieces together, even if we have a really good understanding of what each of the individual pieces looks like.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Nikos. I'd like to turn now to Sarah, because, I mean, in your writing, you've looked a lot at how energy and industrial transitions happen, and indeed what can accelerate them. At the moment, there's a tendency in some parts of the energy debate to focus on, what we need to stop doing. So obviously, we need to stop approving new coal-fired plants, and in our net zero pathway, and the fall in oil and gas demand is sufficiently steep that we don't need any new oil and gas field approvals either. I mean, an alternative way to look at things would be to, what do we need to do to change our existing infrastructure? What do we need to build up, improve efficiency, build up new low emissions infrastructure, and so on? So my question to you is do we have the balance right in the way we're approaching this?
Yeah, so thanks also for the opportunity to speak today, and I echo the other panelists' comments and congratulations on the great publication that I think is really helping to advance exactly this conversation. So, I think it is obviously very important to think about what we need to stop doing. It also is a more efficient and lower cost way that if we don't go further down a road that we're going to have to walk back. But I think that there is not enough discussion that's going on about, in particular, managing really this mid-transition period. And so, I think on the one hand, one of the solutions to the volatility when you're in the transition period is actually to get out of it more quickly, right? And I think that, as the presentation that your colleague shared showed, and that's further underscored by some findings that, perhaps actually even aside from the price volatility, a faster transition will be cheaper due to learning costs as you're deploying more technology. So there's a lot of good reasons to, move more quickly within a, somewhat still reasonable pace. But actually, I think one of the big blind spots to me is what the dynamics of this so-called, mid-transition period are, which is a period I would define where each system is really constrained materially by the other, the existing fossil system and this future low carbon system that you want to get to. And I think in a lot of cases, we're only just entering this period. And so, you think about the efficient operation of an electricity grid, for example, and a set of fossil plants there versus some end state that you can, write down where you would be at a very low carbon electricity system. But in that middle, you're actually going to see a lot of constraints, just to give an example, imposed, for example, on the ramping of the fossil plants so that they are operating in a less efficient way than they might be otherwise. And then similarly, as you start to, move over to a slightly higher concentration of low carbon resources, that they are also not able to sort of operate in the most efficient way that they could. And I think many of the metrics that we're using are really anchored in one of the two endpoints and aren't considering what those dynamics of the middle look like. And therefore, then, we're completely missing the opportunity to kind of optimize and manage them. And then I think that's further underscored by some of the challenges that are coming out. And we've seen that around extreme weather, where, obviously correlation is not causation. And I think there's a lot of reasons that, as Nikos was also saying, that it's not that one system is inherently less secure than the other, but if you're used to a system operating under conditions of less extreme weather, and now as we move into this period where systems are being exposed to more extreme weather, it's very easy to make these sort of intellectual shortcuts and say, oh, well, this system is less secure. And so again, there, I think, it's important to differentiate the cause, but at the same time, we're sort of having to go through this transition and shift from a high to low carbon system, while also adding on a separate challenge, interlinked, of course, but separate challenge of managing systems under extreme weather as well, too. And so I think across all of those areas, to come back to your question, we've spent a lot of time thinking about where we need to get to. And I think appropriately, insofar as we haven't until recently, really started to see the growth rates and the deployment that maybe brings us into that mid-transition period. We haven't really talked about what it's going to take to manage the dynamics during that time.
Thank you. That's a very interesting observation. I mean, do you have any suggestions for the sorts of metrics that we should be looking at to try and manage that mid-transition period? Certainly, we found in our own analysis, when you look at, for instance, the investments that you need for getting to net zero, there's a sort of simplistic binary view that, obviously you need to just stop investing in the dirty stuff and invest in the clean. But in practice, there's a large sort of middle ground of very sort of contingent or transition investments, where sort of contingent is you're investing in something like an electric vehicle that is potentially clean if you clean up the electricity supply, or you're investing in something that reduces emissions from an emissions intensive sector, but doesn't get them immediately to deliver a net zero energy service. So, give us some more ideas on how we can sort of orient ourselves in that mid-transition period.
Yes, I think two separate things that are important. One is really considering that temporal element and really valuing or giving a value to how long it takes to make that transition, because exactly that transition is to some extent going to have some messiness to it, and so shortening it has a value, and so more consideration of how that time period might impact the outcomes. I think the second is really a recognition that some of the things that we've historically considered sort of individually need to really be considered more within that system. And so, for example, the levelized cost of electricity from a certain type of resource, has a lot of meaning on its own within the historical system or some future system that we get to, but it's maybe perhaps less meaningful within that transition period, as is, the concepts, again, coming back to that temporal element of how long we're considering the costs over a given lifetime, right? And it may make a lot of sense in many cases to actually shorten the lifetime of infrastructure as we go through that transition. So again, considering how a change in the lifetime of infrastructure, or what the value of, for example, installing solar plus storage today, even if it's a higher cost compared to a full lifetime of a low carbon option that might need to be, retired prematurely, that of course changes the math when you're looking at those two options.
Tim, can I make a quick comment?
Oh, sorry, please.
I think what Sarah said is so important. It's something we've been thinking a lot about, not the end state, but this period of getting there, the process of getting there. And I just want to highlight, in addition to the energy system and energy market and energy price issues, having served at the National Security Council, I think that plays out equally with geopolitical and national security issues. And if you look at a broad range of issues we've traditionally thought about as being connected to energy security, this sort of, again, conventional wisdom that, the net zero world, petrostates collapse, China rises, geopolitical risks as we've known it in the past are reduced and mitigated. The process is messier and different. And when you look at the influence of petrostates, the influence of major gas suppliers like Russia, the importance of shale, China's dominance in critical minerals, processing, production, refining, advanced nuclear, low carbon synthetic fuels, where we'll probably start with blue and go to green, trade conflict or cooperation on almost every one of those dimensions. The middle period that she talked about is going to be different than the end state. And we need foreign policymakers to understand that, I think, more with a little more depth, and sort of help plan for how to manage that process.
Yeah, I think so. And domestically also employment as well, too, which I didn't mention, is another thing that kind of gets caught in that middle.
That's great. Well, thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks very much, Jason, for that point as well. I'd like to turn now to Yoshi Kobayashi. I mentioned up front that the IEJ has recently released its new outlook, and that speaks directly to some of these issues of disorderly transitions. I'd like to refer back to the slide that Tayoun had up front, where he looked at the fact that oil and gas supply investment is essentially in one of the very few indicators that's in line with our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, whereas the transition related spending is well short of that. So in the WEO we concluded that the way out of this is clearly to ramp up spending that reduces then oil and gas demand. But I'd like to turn to you and ask, like, you presumably looked at the same issues in your new outlook. What did you find?
Thank you, Tim, for your kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude toward IEA for inviting me today. I'm very honored to be a part of this great seminar with distinguished moderator and panelists. Regarding your question, we definitely agree with IEA's approach to focus on the reduction of demand through intensive investments. Given the origin of IEJ as an organization of energy importers and consumers, it is very relevant for IEA to focus on the demand side. But our point is counting too much on the demand reduction contains some risks, because as some of the previous speakers mentioned, we think in the real world, reducing oil demand is not that easy. In our latest outlook, which you kindly suggested, we also provided 3 different scenarios like IEA's outlook. But one of the biggest differences in our outlook is that all of our scenarios expect oil demand will continue to grow at least until 2025. So it is a conclusion that even though we assume aggressive adoption of various demand side measures, the world oil demand will keep growing, at least in the medium term. I agree with that if we could invest intensively to adopt more EVs and FCVs to a vehicle fleet. But we should be reminded that the oil demand to be reduced by EVs and FCV is road transportation demand for oil, which is only 44% of the total oil demand. So this means that even if we could fully eliminate all of the engine and diesel vehicles, we will still have more than half of the demand. And according to our analysis, this remaining half of demand is very difficult to be reduced or substituted, because those demands are petrochemical feedstock or aviation fuels or demand in remote locations. So if we stand realistic viewpoint, I have to say that reducing oil demand is not that easy, and we should also be prepared for demand increase in coming years. In our outlook, we also made a simple calculation about what will happen if all of the upstream investment will stop and world oil production capacity will decline at 4% annually. We found that the world will have a supply capacity shortage either in 2024 or 2025, depending on what demand scenarios. So based on our demand scenarios and calculation, we think we need consistent investment in the new upstream production capacity. That is one of the major conclusions of our outlook. And I also like to note that now we are talking about when the oil demand peak will come. But we should not forget that even though we will have the oil demand peak in the near future, we will keep using oil after the peak. According to our analysis, in the lowest demand case, we will expect the oil demand peak will come in year 2025. But even in that scenario, oil demand as of 2040 is almost same as the demand of demand as of 2020. So this is not a small amount. We need large oil production capacity, even as of 2040. So to sum up my points, I definitely agree with IEA's position to work seriously on the demand reduction, but expecting too much on the demand side action looks risky because we may find that such a demand action will not cause intended result. We should be prepared for a case where the demand reduction will not be achieved as intended, and we need consistent investment in upstream capacities. That's it for myself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kobayashi. And indeed, it's clear that there are segments of oil demand that will be considerably easier to reduce compared with others, and the difficult ones are clearly going to be in long distance transport. That said, our own analysis of all of the announced pledges made in the run-up to Glasgow suggests that if these are implemented in time and in full, then a peak in oil demand around 2025 would be followed by a decline then in demand, so that by 2050 we are approaching 75 million barrels a day. Now, of course, that's still well above the levels in our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, but it is, I think, a steeper decline than the one that you mentioned just now. I'd like to follow up with you on Japan's own carbon neutrality net zero pledge, because as Japan moves towards its net zero target, particularly for some of these difficult to abate sectors, Japan will be increasingly looking to low carbon hydrogen rich fuels to support its ambition. And I'd like to get your view on how you think that might develop over time. So do you see any risks emerging as hydrogen takes a larger share in the energy system, and particularly given that in the case of Japan, I think it's reasonable to assume that a large share of the hydrogen that is used within the Japanese energy system will be imported?
Thank you for asking a question on the hydrogen. Yes, I think we are on a good track to achieve the government announced adoption target. The government announced that we will have 3 million tons of hydrogen as of 2030 and 20 million tons of hydrogen and ammonia as of 2050. And now a number of Japanese companies are working to develop a hydrogen supply chain globally. And I understand that the pilot test for mixed combustion in Japanese power plants is performing very well. So I'm convinced that we can achieve the announced adoption target in 2030 or 2050. Yes, as you mentioned that we see some risks for hydrogen. Certainly, we will have supply security risk, as Nikos mentioned, and also carbon footprint risk. I know that there is now ongoing debate whether blue hydrogen is really a clean fuel or not. We think that we take a kind of neutral position toward the color of hydrogen. So as long as it contributes to the emission reductions, we think that both green and blue hydrogen will play a very important role for Japan. We need to closely monitor the carbon emissions or methane leakage from the entire supply chain has to be properly monitored. And also, I like to note that there are some HSE risks because ammonia and hydrogen is to some extent very, it has to be handled with caution. Ammonia has toxic, so we need to manage those risks. And another potential risk is impact on the existing market. Now, ammonia is an international traded commodity, so there is already market. And now we will have an incremental demand for ammonia into the current ammonia market. At this moment, our expected demand as of 2030 is only 1.5% of the world ammonia demand. So I don't think such incremental demand will cause not serious impact on the price level, but nonetheless, we need to closely look at those potential price impact on the existing market. So I think those are the potential risks.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kobayashi. We have around 10 minutes left. I'd like to cover a little bit more ground. And one of the areas that was in Taiyun's presentation that we didn't return to at all was the question of critical minerals and what risks might arise along those value chains, particularly given the high geographical concentration of production and indeed of midstream sort of processing and refining operations. So I'd like to turn to Sarah, if I may, and ask, I mean, what's your view on some of those risks? How can countries manage them more effectively?
Yeah, so I think that those risks are very real. I think when, a starting point is to say how those look differently for different minerals. We know that a low carbon energy future is one that's very mineral intensive, but some of the minerals are and metals like steel and copper and others are within markets that are already relatively robust. And so while the demand for those minerals will increase significantly, the total demand coming from energy technologies will remain modest in comparison. I think it's very important, obviously, for governments to focus especially on those minerals that will see a lot of growth, but only achieve still a relatively small market size overall, where they get a lot of attention, I think rightly so, not because the market itself will necessarily become so large, but because they are so critical, and there is a risk that the market will not be large enough to be functioning in such an efficient way as the fossil markets, for example, that we have built to date. And so, I think governments certainly need to have a good understanding of where those different minerals are. I think there's then a long list really of things that governments can be doing to better manage the security, some of which can be borrowed from energy security, but not all of which, because these are very inherently, because we're not combusting them, they are a very different type of market at the end of the day, and they are also very different, as I said, through the fact that they are much smaller and much more separated, distinct than perhaps the oil market overall. But a couple of the things that I think I would highlight is, on the one hand, leading into this, R&D support, both for deployment and development of new mining approaches, including both technology to reduce environmental impact, but also things to mine existing tailings, really looking at ways that we can have a lower impact to produce the materials that we need. Rather than just a stockpiling approach, I think that strategic procurement to help to create markets is a very important role for governments, especially to manage the volatility in this period as demand scales up. I think, although I would also add that over recent months, I think we're starting to see the private sector step into that role. When you look at lithium and the electric cars and the vehicle manufacturers, I think many are starting to play that large procurement role. Another area I think of importance is really R&D support to reduce the demand for the amount of minerals that are required in each of these technologies, and that's something that has been historically very successful, right? For example, in the solar sector, where you've seen the amount of silver required in each panel decline dramatically over time. So, I think there's also this issue that it's not a static demand. And then finally, I would note that I think that there's also the potential for the mining sector and growth in demand for materials to play a role in providing jobs for a just transition as we see a major shift in demand away from fossil fuels. And so, I think there's an important opportunity that governments also need to consider around how this can be part of the solution to a challenge of managing that transition.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. I'd like to turn to one other commodity, and that's natural gas, and ask Nikos about his view, because I think you can certainly argue that today's crisis is not a clean energy crisis, but it may be a crisis for the natural gas world. So I was wondering, when you look out of the window and see what's happening in natural gas markets, does it affect your view on the role that natural gas might end up playing in energy transitions?
That's a really important question, Tim. So thank you for asking it. I think first our vocabulary must evolve over time. We talk about fuels and technologies are as firm or dispatchable. One of the things we've learned, and we knew this, but we've learned it really well, is for gas to be dispatchable, someone has to produce it, process it, transport it, and store it, and for it to be ready to be dispatched. And we've seen multiple times in 2021 the gas system failing to do that. So I think we just have to make sure that our language is more nuanced and richer as we think about what is firm and dispatchable, and make sure we have a holistic supply chain view when it comes to natural gas. That's point number one. Point number two is our system is relying more and more on LNG. LNG is now about 13% of the global gas market, double what it was 20 years ago. And LNG is great. It's geographically flexible. You can send it from one part of the world to the other. But LNG is not everything. LNG is not seasonally flexible. LNG can't really do underutilized sort of spare capacity to respond to short-term shifts in demand. And I think it's really important, just as we hail the improvement in energy security that comes from the LNG sector, to also appreciate the limits of LNG and what it can't do for the gas system. And that brings me to the final point, which is really about seasonal balancing. And that's really the one part that is crucial. You can say, and I think it's right, that this is a gas crisis. But one of the things that I hope people appreciate is that gas is a really tough assignment. You look at the seasonal fluctuation in gas use, especially in the Northern Hemisphere where gas is used for space heating. It is a tough system to balance, and it's tougher when there's declining domestic or local production in Europe, and you have to rely more on storage and on LNG. I think what's really important is for us to understand that this is a really difficult system to manage if you have these massive swings between summer and winter. And it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of investment and the right policies to make sure that that system can meet demand. Not just, we often talk about the swing from midnight to midday. I'm particularly worried about the swing from July to January, right? That kind of swing is what we rely a lot on natural gas to do. And as we grade gas, and we can give it a failing grade in some regards at this moment in time, we also have to understand that it's taking a very hard test, and that someone else will have to step in to meet that need, even as we transition our energy system to new technologies and fuels.
That's great, Nikos. Thanks ever so much. And we're nearly out of time, but I'd like to give Jason the chance to round things up. I mean, you've worked at very high levels in government, and I suppose I'd like you to address these final words, in a sense, to policymakers. So we've talked about a lot of risks. We've talked about some opportunities here. So what in your view are the key sort of takeaways for policymakers, both on things that they should be doing more of, and probably also some things that they shouldn't do? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the great session. Really interesting to hear from everyone. It was interesting to hear the different views in the announced pledges, and then what Mr. Kobayashi said about the view from IEJ. I understand. I just want to point out, I understand why the skepticism that we could bring oil demand down. For anyone who crunches numbers in the space, we know how hard it is to make oil demand start to fall, given the turnover of the fleet, and you start to build in more aggressive assumptions, but we're also growing the number of cars. We should acknowledge what he just said is climate failure. So those things are both true. And so we do need to sort of keep our eye on the ball of where we need to get to, as difficult as that is. And that's why I think the question you asked is so important. What policymakers need to do and need to think about to de-risk the energy transition, economically, geopolitically, and in other ways. So part of it is conversations like this. I think just talking about this issue and understanding and identifying what risks we're talking about. And as Sarah said, in this process of transition, not just the end state. She gave examples in critical minerals, I think, that are exactly right. I mean, we barely started, in some sense, to look for these things yet. As we think about improved recycling, my colleagues at Columbia who are coming up with more plentiful materials like iron and manganese and nickel to do things that, rather than more scarce minerals, that'll make it that'll improve things, and then also, in addition to substitutes, just producing it in more places. So I think government needs to identify these, and then there's a set of things. Nikos talked about some of them to improve capacity market rules, use regulation in the power sector to help balance the intermittency as we think about certain pieces of infrastructure retiring, develop financial instruments that allow them to play a bigger role to help balance things in those unusual periods of time or seasonal peaks. He talked about not removing existing tools we have. We might need to smooth volatility more, not less, say with strategic stockpiles like the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So I think all of those and many more are important for us to think about and as we move forward. And the last thing I'll say that we haven't really talked too much about is how this transition plays out differently. We talked about the process, not just the end state, in rich countries and poor countries, developing and developed. And I think we're going to already seeing those tensions come to the fore in Glasgow this year. There'll be even more on the table as we go into the next COP in Africa next year. And I think that is also an area where there could be more conflict and tension. And unless we think carefully about how rich countries can help not just with assistance, financial assistance, and make good on those pledges, but also think about other tools to use public finance to catalyze private finance for the trillions of dollars we need in infrastructure investment in countries that use very little energy today, haven't mostly contributed to causing the climate problem, but or where the emissions growth is coming from in the future, unless we follow a different path.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I mean, that's a very important set of observations, particularly your last point about the differing perspectives across countries depending on their stage of development. There's a whole new other set of issues that we would love to unpack, perhaps at a different time, since we're out of time today. But I think I'd like to conclude by just pointing out that the World Energy Outlook this year, for the first time, is free to download. So I would invite you all to look at Chapter 6, which is devoted specifically to the issue that we've addressed today, to energy security and transitions. I'd like to thank very much my colleague Tae-Yoon, who was the co-lead of that chapter, together with Peter Ziniewski. And a particular thanks today to our excellent panel, to Jason, to Nikos, to Sarah, to Yoshi, for some really outstanding insights on the things that we need to be thinking about. And I appreciated also Jason's comment that, you know, conversations like this can play an important role in getting the thought processes moving that can address some of these risks in the future. That brings us to the end of our webinar for today. Many thanks to all of those who joined us online. Today is day 2 of our WEO week, but I would like to remind you that there's 3 more days to go, and Wednesday is electricity. So please join us for a discussion on the outlook for electricity and some of the issues that raises tomorrow. And in the meantime, thanks very much again for joining.